My name is Sarah Schlesinger. I'm fortunate to be the CEO of Texas Water Foundation, a statewide nonpartisan nonprofit that works in the areas of water policy, workforce and leadership initiatives, and has been building a statewide water campaign. We are the proud educational sponsors of the Texas Water Caucus and your hosts today. Texas Water Day is a long-standing tradition of bringing a free educational program to the Texas Capitol during the legislative session to learn about our most pressing water policy issues and to support the prioritization of water. And we're so grateful to our sponsors. Ashley. We're very grateful to our sponsors and to our partners for helping us keep this tradition alive and keeping it free and open to the public and to the media. A recording of this will be available to the public after on YouTube, so feel free to pass it along to others. Today, we will hear from water champions about the state of Texas water, about policy priorities, as well as the future of Texas water. And at the end of the panels, we're going to invite you to join us at Schultzgarten for an evening of good conversation, food and drink, and live music, because we are, after all, in Austin. So to start the conversation, we were expecting to have a legislator from Lubbock who has made water one of his top priorities and has laid the groundwork for a generational investment in water infrastructure. Unfortunately, as you know how these things go, his schedule is a moving frontier today, and so we're going to be like water and adjust, and so we'll welcome him when he has the opportunity. But I would like to say that in 2023, Texas Water Foundation was proud to sponsor or to recognize him as our Rainmaker of the Year, together with Representative Tracy King, for the passage of Senate Bill 28 and the bicameral effort to establish the Texas Water Fund. And since then, no one has worked harder or been a larger champion for water funding than our Texas Water Day sponsor, official sponsor, Senator Charles Perry. So we'll be hearing from him later, but for now, let's, why don't we welcome this panel with a big round of applause, and we'll transfer over there. Y'all ready? So if Senator Perry, if Chairman Perry had been here, undoubtedly he would have started with a big picture view of where we are right now in the state of Texas water. And that is that Texas is seeing unprecedented population growth, 70% projected over the next 50 years, most of that happening in our urban growth corridor. We're seeing diminishing water supply. We're seeing aging infrastructure. We're seeing our natural infrastructure increasingly fragile and at risk. And additionally, we're seeing our human infrastructure, our workforce, aging and increasingly fragile. And so we find ourselves at an inflection point where we are talking water infrastructure, where we're talking about supply, and we're talking about funding. So we're very fortunate today to have this esteemed panel wearing a beautiful combination of blue and green for a wave of water and a wave of funding. With the hopes that this will be a generational legislative session for water, our hope today with this panel is to talk about what we're trying to solve for. So joining us today, we have Sarah Kirkle with the Texas Water Association, formerly known as TWCA. We have Heather Harward with the Texas Water Supply Partners. We have Lara Zent with the Texas Rural Water oh my gosh, why am I blanking? Thank you, Water Association, that's right. We have Vanessa Puig with Environmental Defense Fund, and we have Jeremy Mazur with Texas 2036. Let's give them a big round of applause and welcome them today. So each of you are statewide water experts representing slightly different organizations, slightly different focus. When you consider the state of Texas water, what are the challenges that you think have persisted, have changed, or are on the surface, so to speak, for you this legislative session? And let's just go straight down the line. Sarah, and we'll start with you. And we're going to have to play microphone hot potato.
Excellent. All right. Well, when I think about the challenges as we see them and as they continue to persist, I think it kind of boils down to a couple of things. One, the costs continue to grow. Our projects continue to get more complex. the water solutions are not as simple or as straightforward as they have been. 2, we've got to recognize that the state has a role in this, that the state, it's not just on the locals because the costs are so expensive, that to the extent that the state can help in terms of providing cost-effective financing to those local communities, that can offset some of the impacts to the local ratepayer. And 3, infrastructure's nature is just that it has a constant need to be repaired and replaced. And that leads us to the path of a dedicated revenue source like we see in transportation, because we've got to find a way for that continuous reinvestment to help us keep that infrastructure operating, treating and dealing with new growth, and helping us continue to have that sustainability when it comes to taking care of our infrastructure.
Thanks.
Thanks, Sarah. When I walked in the room earlier, the person that I've known longest in this room is Joey Park, and he asked me if I was going to tell him anything that he didn't already know. And so what I am going to say in terms of what has persisted is something that those of you all that have been around since 1997 and before do already know. And that's that the issue that has persisted since the passage of Senate Bill 1 in 1997 is a sustainable source of funding for the implementation of water infrastructure. So before we go any further, I want everybody in this room that was part of Senate Bill 1 in 97 to raise your hand. These folks have been working on this issue that long, and that's the bad news. But the good news is that something has changed in 2025, and that's that Chairman Perry and Governor Abbott have raised the profile of the importance of investing in our water infrastructure, coupled with the backing support of many people sitting on this stage, especially Texas 2036. Chairman Perry's done tireless work to raise the profile of water infrastructure financing. I've been watching this issue since, like I said, 1997, and been actively involved in trying to move the needle since 2023. And I can tell you, when I have seen the needle move, it's when awareness is high and people are engaged. So that's the good news. We have real opportunity in 2025 to do something and build on the work of the good folks in this room who've been working on the issue since 1997.
All right. Well, in rural Texas, we're continuing to see a lot of growth, and the population's coming out to the rural areas. We're very grateful, and I think the awareness was really evident even last session with $1 billion going and creating a new Texas Water Fund. And I think the utilities of our state have really proven that there's a need because it was fully subscribed very quickly. We definitely appreciated some of that funding going over to the Rural Water Assistance Fund, so dedicated specifically for small utilities, and the Water Development Board made that happen, and we're seeing communities already benefiting from that. So excited, we're part of the team to keep it going. There's a lot more need out there. Another challenge, and Sarah touched on it, is that we're losing a lot of water and wastewater utility operators to retirement, and so we're going to need folks to run these utilities into the future. As long as we're turning on our faucets and taking showers and flushing toilets, we need talented people, so that's something we really want to attract young people to our industry.
What's the state of Texas water for groundwater, Vanessa?
Yeah, so I have a slightly different perspective on this issue, although I agree with everybody here. My focus is just more on groundwater. And so at EDF, we are working to ensure that water resources in Texas are managed sustainably and proactively for the benefit of both people and nature. And this is especially true when it comes to groundwater, which provides over half of the state's drinking water supply, almost 100% of the drinking water for rural communities, almost 80% of the water for agriculture, and is an incredibly important source of water for our rivers and our streams and springs, so surface water, which is the other half of Texas's water supply, and ensures that those are flowing during drought. Groundwater underpins our water supply in Texas, and aquifers are critical pieces of water infrastructure. And it's infrastructure that we don't have to spend billions of dollars building. It's already here beneath our feet. We just need to monitor, measure, and manage it in order to to have it retain its function, which provides a benefit for both people and nature. And unfortunately, we're not doing an adequate job right now of this in Texas. We have missed many opportunities over past legislative sessions to invest in and improve groundwater management. And so the result is that with some exceptions, groundwater levels are not being managed proactively in Texas, and they are declining. And I'll share a bit more about what we can do about that in a little bit.
So Sarah, I'm going to start with an apology. I didn't get the memorandum about wearing green. So I wore blue, but I thought to show my spirit, I'd wear the Chewbacca, the Wookiee socks. In case you see him, it's Chewbacca and 2 stormtroopers.
Apology accepted.
Thank you. I'm glad I could express the atonement. So the question's like, what's changed, right? And I think there's a recognition that there's this thing that our state leaders and the legislature absolutely love. It's not exactly water yet, but it's this thing called the Texas economic miracle, where we have rapid economic growth and population growth. Texas is just beating the charts and the socks off of other states when it comes to growth and potential with so many promising sectors, such as data, semiconductors, energy, space exploration, you name it. This legislature and the leadership like this Texas economic miracle. And it needs 3 ingredients to happen. It needs a qualified workforce, a dependable electric grid, and reliable water infrastructure. And then, so even though last year we had a big water session and we were fantastic allies in making the case for why we need to create this Texas Water Fund, a lot of evidence has come up suggesting that even though last session was a big water session, creating the Texas Water Fund, there's a lot that needs to be done to shore up our water supplies and fix our aging water systems. And we need to do this if we want to protect this thing, this shiny object called the Texas economic miracle.
Thank you, making us 8th strongest economy in the world, and potentially, if we get it figured out.
We're about to beat France. So
There you go. Well, what other incentive do we need? So let's talk a little bit more about urban and rural needs, right? Water tends to not be partisan, but it has historically found moments of tension between urban and rural needs. Hello, Chairman Kitzman. We've got the chairman of the Texas Water Caucus with us. Good to see you. Glad you're here. So let's talk a little bit about urban and rural needs in terms of the state of Texas water, the infrastructure needs there, and the cost specifically. So while surveying both urban and rural needs, the Texas Water Infrastructure Network's recent capital needs survey identified our top water infrastructure needs as treatment, aging infrastructure, and water supply. So Lara, if y'all wouldn't mind, you represent rural water utilities across the state, and you completed a study on water line loss, and then more recently a study on water availability. Can you tell us what the findings were of both of those studies?
Yes, and I have some notes here for you. Yeah, so these were studies that we did. The water line loss one was before the last legislative session. Both of these were on Senator Perry's request to help gather data going into the sessions. So we surveyed community water systems across the state with 50,000, serving 50,000 population or less. And of course, we found that, of course, water lines are the infrastructure that utilities are least likely to replace regularly. There's a lot of challenges there, and you don't see it. So Texas has approximately 838,797 miles of water lines, which is 155,000 miles longer than the total amount of roadway miles in our state. So it's big lift there. And the longevity of water pipes depends on type, correct installation, soil conditions, moisture, temperature, and pressure. But on average, it's 35 years. And we found that 70% of water line infrastructure in Texas is at or near the end of anticipated useful life, with 57% exceeding it. And as we know, aging pipes are more prone to crack and leaking and all of that. The cost is pretty staggering to replace water lines. So we estimated, kind of conservatively estimated this was back in 2022, that would cost $322 billion to replace all the water lines that needed replacement in Texas. And costs have gone up since then, as Sarah pointed out earlier. For example, we actually, one of our members just got some funding from the Water Development Board Rural Water Assistance Fund to replace 1.3 miles of 50-year-old leaky pipe with a new 6-inch water line, and the cost was estimated over $2 million. So that's a lot more on average.
How long was that line again? Say that again.
1.3 miles.
1.3 miles
It was
for
$2 million.
$2 million.
So the costs are, so you almost can't have enough money for what it's going to cost. And then more recently, Senator Perry asked us to conduct a survey, pretty simple one, asking water utilities around the state how long they expected their current water supply to last. And over 50% of rural utilities said that they would run out of water supply in the next 20 years. And the biggest factor was population growth, a concern. So one thing we noted in the survey, and like Vanessa noted earlier, is most of the utilities are utilizing their cheapest source right now, which is the groundwater right in their area. So their next source is going to be more expensive. If it's a desal or piping it in from somewhere else, that's going to be a lot more expensive. But it's time to start planning for that now.
Thank you so much. So Sarah, Senator Perry has been consistent in his concern around water supply and specifically finding momentum and funding available for regional large-scale projects. Texas Water Association is the largest and the oldest water policy organization in Texas, with a lot of large regional entities within your membership. So for our large water supply entities that span these urban expanses and growth at the regional scale, how are those water infrastructure and supply challenges measuring up as opposed to what is being experienced on the rural side of things?
Well, I think the costly and complex nature of water is not unique to urban versus rural areas. Everybody's seeing those costs more expensive. And to your point, we have most, if not all, of the wholesale big regional water providers within our membership. And it's really challenging. We think about water a lot of ways as a hub and spoke situation. And the high growth areas of our state are kind of on the fringes of that area, right? And so you've got a lot of really high demand that's going in these areas. And so it's a very large challenge for them. And as our hubs and our spokes, I can't speak at the same time, but you get the visual. The spokes have had to get bigger and longer because we can't just go to the outskirts. We use up the water in our city areas, and we have to go to the outskirts, and then we have to go further in larger projects that cost a lot more money. And so for these regional providers who are trying to satisfy the thirsty growth and demands, not just from population growth, but also through the economic development needs, they're having to go further. And so we're getting to the place where those spokes or those strategic pipelines, essentially is what we're talking about, are going to be going further and beyond any one region. And they're going to have to go out and beyond to bring it in order to satisfy those needs. And that's just sort of an inevitable thing that we've been talking about since the 1960s. But also, and to Laura's point, the rural needs in this state are unquestionable. They're significant, and we've got to find a way forward. And our membership has both rural and urban areas. But the Texas Water Fund prioritizes rural needs and not urban needs. And when you think about the economic engine of the state and the Texas Miracle, as Jeremy mentioned, you've got to really think about whether or not those communities can access funding in the same way. And Houston hasn't been shy about talking about their water infrastructure needs, but unfortunately their story isn't unique. All of the major cities are facing these same issues. And Laura and I kind of talked about this earlier, and we said, okay, well, if rural communities think the cities are getting all the money and the cities think that the rural are getting all the money, then who's getting the money? And the truth is our demands are such that we just can't meet all of everybody's needs all the way around.
So for those that are not familiar, the last legislative session and the passage of Senate Bill 28 and Senate Joint Resolution 75 created, and then Prop 6, created the Texas Water Fund, from which funding gets dispersed to a variety of different funding programs at Texas Water Development Board. So whether you are a rural entity or urban, there's different funding programs that are available. So this legislative session, and I think if Chairman Perry had been here, he would tell you a little bit about this. The conversation is going to be, yes, about water supply, but also about how funding might be dedicated for water infrastructure and dispersed then across those different funding mechanisms. But let's continue for one more moment on rural, right? Because there's not just our built infrastructure in our rural communities, our urban communities on the regional scale. There's also this natural infrastructure, as it were, aquifers as infrastructure. And as you say, Vanessa, the majority of our rural Texans still rely on groundwater, whether that is as their primary water supply through a utility or, in fact, just through a water well. So if we think about aquifers as part of the water infrastructure, tell us a little bit more about those primary challenges at the statewide scale. What is it that we're seeing as it overlaps with that population growth and the demographic shifts that we're seeing?
So I'm going to pick 3 challenges, but I think with respect to groundwater, there are a lot of them. The first 2 are really obvious. Texas is becoming more arid. Drought is the new norm. And so with less rain, that means there's less water recharging aquifers that are able to recharge. The second, which we've kind of already touched a little bit about here, is the population growth. And the most recent state demographers report says that over 1,200 people a day are calling Texas home. I think some of that accounts for babies, too. It's not just people moving here. I remember they said that in the last presentation I attended. But most of those people are moving to urban areas, and so we're going to see municipal demand outpacing agricultural demand for water by 2070. But what's interesting, and I think actually kind of worrisome, is that most of that growth is occurring in the counties surrounding urban cores, surrounding cities, in what is formerly going to be known as rural Texas. And those are parts of the state that lack county development regulations. And most importantly, as Lara mentioned, those areas rely on groundwater. And so we are starting to already see groundwater levels declining. We looked at groundwater monitoring wells in the Texas Triangle that the Water Development Board has. And if you compare those water levels with population growth, you can see a corresponding increase in population and a corresponding decrease in groundwater levels. So the third challenge, which I think is a little bit harder to really visualize or comprehend, is that the state has not equipped groundwater conservation districts with the tools that they need to be able to manage groundwater proactively. And I think this is also why we're seeing groundwater levels being depleted. And what I hope everybody takes away just from my remarks today is that it's not too late. We can actually change this. I think a lot of people think that it's too late, that we can't turn around and manage our groundwater sustainably. And for most of our aquifers in the state, that is not the case. It will be difficult, but we can do it. It will take additional regulations. It will take solutions that incentivize the conservation of groundwater. In some cases, it will take alternative or new sources of water to relieve pressure on fresh groundwater. But most importantly, it's going to take more funding. I think groundwater districts, they're not receiving any of the funding right now that's being spent. So
more people on the list that are not receiving funding, but there's a lot of people that are receiving funding. Go ahead, Jeremy.
So, Vanessa, you didn't use your famous line. I said it earlier. You did? Okay. She has this great line that she says, aquifers are infrastructure. And it's a great line to think about, what aquifers mean to communities, especially rural communities, as being that only water supply. And sometimes it's their source of water treatment as well. Mm-hmm. Sorry if I didn't hear that earlier.
you're so used to me saying it.
As we as we talk about water security in our water portfolios, certainly I think we all find ourselves saying those communities that are reliant on a singular source are at higher risk, right? So in the move towards trying to diversify your water portfolios and finding funding for it, that's where we're able to reduce that risk. So Jeremy, let's stay with you here. So as I mentioned, last legislative session, you all worked very hard in the passage of Senate Bill 28 and the creation of the Texas Water Fund, an umbrella funding mechanism at the Texas Water Development Board. And this session, the conversation has markedly shifted to new water supply and to the possibility of dedicated funding for the Texas Water Fund. So when you listen to any news coverage this session, you're going to hear references to both the need for new water supply and the need to address leaky pipes. The phrasing leaky pipes was even in the governor's declaration as well. And it's clear that the policy conversation this session and the tension potentially will be how that funding gets dispersed across those two areas. So how is Texas 2036 thinking about that conversation?
So generally, our water infrastructure falls into, and Chairwoman Stepney said this, there's like two key buckets. There's our water supply bucket, where we need to expand and diversify our water supply portfolio to prepare ourselves for future droughts. And one of the things we always need to think about is that Texas is a very drought-prone state. How many of you guys lived here in 2011? All right, congratulations. You lived through the worst one-year drought in recorded history. You can get a t-shirt saying I survived when you walk in. No, but I mean, we're a drought-prone state, and that's why we need to expand and diversify our water supply portfolio. The second bucket we have is with these aging, deteriorating, and leaking drinking water and wastewater systems. And we see these systems pop up all the time, like when school districts have to cancel class because the city has a boil water notice. Or towns that literally just have to shut their businesses down because their water system failed because it was built right after World War II. We're seeing stories like this time and time and time again about the problems that our aging, deteriorating drinking water and wastewater systems are presenting to our communities. And our analysis suggests that all of these incidents, they really amount to a series of small economic cuts that amount to being a meaningful wound to our state's economy. Texas 2036 projects that these aging, deteriorating systems can inflict upwards of $320 billion in economic losses for Texas. And for comparison, this is about the size of our current state budget. And so when we look at the two issues, the need to diversify our water supply portfolio to prepare for drought, to fix our aging, deteriorating drinking water and wastewater systems, they're two very important buckets, and in some ways they're related. But they all point to the bigger issue that Texas has an infrastructure problem that we're trying to address this session.
Thank you. So Heather, this is not the first time that water champions have gathered and worked towards getting a dedicated funding mechanism for water infrastructure, is it? Give us some perspective. What's the history on that?
Thank you, Sarah, for asking me one of my favorite questions. I think it's important to look back through history and understand where you've been so that you know where you're trying to get. And as I mentioned earlier, the Texas legislature has been looking for a sustainable source of funding for water infrastructure since 1997. I'm sure there were attempts prior to 97, but I know that they've been in earnest since 97. So that's getting to be close to 30 years, isn't it, CJ? So these attempts, and I'm going to walk through some of the landmark steps that we've taken in water infrastructure funding, but I want y'all to know that in addition to the things we have accomplished, there was a lot of thought, a lot of research, and a lot of dialogue. There have been countless committee hearings, interim hearings, statutory joint created committees, special committees, reports, research, and analyses throughout the 3 decades looking at how we can do this. And the one thing that happens every time at the end of the report is how incredibly important it is. It all comes down to money in the end. Every single thing that every person up here is talking about could maybe not be solved, but really advanced if we had the proper fiscal resources. Also, since 1997, we've been looking at a dedicated source of revenue for water infrastructure funding. A sustainable, predictable, annual, dedicated source of revenue has always been the dream. It's the dream for financing any infrastructure. It's why you'll see that we do it in transportation. Like I said, there have been many attempts, but nobody has ever crossed the bar with respect to a dedicated source of revenue. There is a chance that we might get there this session. But before we talk about getting there this session, let's talk a little bit about where Texas has been in an attempt to cross that high bar. Like I said, Ron Lewis had a bill for revenue stream in 1997 when he worked to pass Senate Bill 1 with Senator Brown. In 2001, in his last session, Senator Brown passed Senate Bill 2, and when Senate Bill 2 was filed, he threw the kitchen sink at it. He had every possible funding mechanism included in that bill as filed. New revenue, existing revenue, taxes, fees, you name it. By the time that bill passed, every last one of those revenue streams was stripped from the bill. But he did do one really important thing in that bill, and that was create the WIF, the Water Infrastructure Fund, which became the financial infrastructure for the first attempts to fund the state water plan. In 2007 and 2009, again, we had to go from 2001 to 2007 and 2009 before, this is so shameless, but I'm doing it, before the former Senator from McLennan, the Honorable Barry Kip Averett, put the first appropriations of general revenue into the Water Infrastructure Fund to begin implementation and financing of state water plan projects. He gets skipped every time we talk about financial efforts and financial infrastructure. He put the first dollars into the WIF, and I'm going to ask you all to give a round of applause to the former Senator Kip Averett. Thank you. Shameless. Following Chairman Averett's funding, he also had formed a joint interim committee that, again, looked at dedicated sources of revenue. The closest that we got, and that we have gotten to date, was Chairman Ritter and Frazier in 2013 when SWIFT was created. Now, I want to be clear, SWIFT is significant because it was a dedicated source of revenue. It is a constitutionally protected account, right? And the legislature put the largest investment to date into SWIFT in 2013 of $2 billion. That was historic. As you will hear Chairwoman Stepney say, it is the workhorse of the Water Development Board in terms of their financing projects. But I'm going to submit to you that it was not generational, because we find ourselves here today needing to recapitalize it. In 2023, as you've already heard about, we took a shift in financing. For the first time, everything that I've mentioned today has been about securing revenue to implement state water plan projects. In 2023, Jeff Walker, then Chairwoman Pop, then Director Stepney, worked with the legislature, Chairman Perry and Chairman Tracy O'King, to pass Senate Bill 28 that was then approved by the voters through Proposition 6. And for the first time, it created a fund that addressed diverse water infrastructure needs. The Texas Water Fund has 8 of the most critical programs at the Texas Water Development Board. Sarah's so tired of watching me carry that thing around. Every meeting we're in, I bring this out. I don't leave home without it. 8 of the most critical programs at the Water Development Board fall beneath the Texas Water Fund. And the legislature invested $1 billion in the newly created fund last session. We're grateful for that. But as you'll learn if you read an op-ed that Vanessa wrote at the end of session, it was merely a down payment on our needs. We put $2 billion, again in 2013, into SWIFT for one program. We're now asking the legislature, coming off of 2 historic surpluses, to make an investment for 8 programs, okay? We had a $31 billion surplus in the last session. We have a $24 billion surplus in this session. The legislature has the opportunity to do something truly generational. And it's by taking a 2-pronged, double-barreled, hybrid funding approach, taking $5 billion out of the $24 billion historic surplus invested in the newly created visionary Texas Water Program to provide immediate assistance to the projects and the programs that they know they need. They have over $150 billion in need, and project sponsors are ready to turn dirt on those projects immediately. Right, Sarah? Then what they can do for the future, what we have the opportunity to do, is get over that highest bar. Close the door that we've all been waiting for, Chairman Kitzman. Let's get a generational, Texas-size, sustainable, predictable source of revenue going into the Texas Water Fund through a dedicated revenue stream.
So let's talk numbers. There's going to be a lot of numbers thrown around this legislative session. Thank you, Heather. And Jeremy, I'm going to come to you here. We know that Texas has significant water infrastructure needs, whether it's for the aging and deteriorating, for that new water supply. The 2022 state water plan has an $80 billion price tag associated. We know that there's another $80 billion for aging infrastructure and then another casual $60 billion for new water supply. And I mean, these billions just keep adding up, right? So it's kind of hard. So Texas 2036 has the cleanest, roundest number out there. About 150 billion? Is that what we're going with?
154 adjusted, and most importantly, it's adjusted for inflation.
Got it. Break down those numbers for us.
So last session, there was a bill, HJR 169, that proposed dedicating funding for water infrastructure. It made it past the House, got to the Senate a little bit too late to make it, but I think we're continuing that conversation that began with HJR 169 last session. But I've been visiting with a lot of offices and about hey, can we try and doing this again next session? And they've asked me two questions. One, what is the total cost that the state needs to spend on addressing our water infrastructure challenges? We hear about the need for water supplies and fixing aging, deteriorating systems. What is the cost? And so we came up with a number of $154 billion, not because it was clean, but because it was accurate. And so that includes $59 billion adjusted for inflation for developing our water supplies identified in state water plan. It also includes about $93 billion for fixing our aging, deteriorating drinking water and wastewater systems. So please note that about 2/3 of our long-term water infrastructure costs are for fixing our aging, deteriorating drinking water and wastewater systems. Sure, water supply is important, but compared to immediate need, a lot of that has to do with our aging, deteriorating systems. The second thing I've been asked about, okay, so we now know what the price tag is. We're on the hook for $154 billion over the next 50 years to fix our water infrastructure. The members wanted to know what the funding gap is. And what they mean by that is we have state and federal funding programs, such as the SWIFT, which are working to provide financial assistance for developing water supplies, fixing systems. We project that these existing state and federal programs will provide about $42 billion over the next 50 years to help our water systems. So this leaves about $110, $112 billion long-term funding gap. And the good news is we don't have to pay for it tomorrow, but it's something that we're going to have to do over the next 50 years if we want to make sure that we have reliable water infrastructure for economic growth and development. And this speaks to the importance of having this dedicated funding stream as proposed within HJR 169 from 2023, and hopefully in some JR that we'll see, if not in hours, at least in days in the weeks ahead.
Wouldn't that be marvelous if it dropped on Texas Water Day?
That would be a miracle. And the bill would walk on water.
It would walk on water, that's right. Lara, let's come back to you and talk about some of our rural water utilities. So earlier you gave us the staggering number of what it costs to replace just a mile of rural water lines. When you look at the big picture of what it's going to cost to address rural water infrastructure, aging infrastructure, what numbers are you landing on?
Yeah, we haven't done the kind of study that 2036 has done. We did have that $322 billion to replace all the water lines, which is more than your infrastructure number. And then as far as, we haven't done a study on as far as what the new water supply would cost to serve rural areas, but I did consult an engineer who works with a lot of our members, and just to give some general numbers, to drill a new water well, depending on where it is, that could cost between $1.5 to $2 million to drill a new water well. To put in a wastewater treatment plant is between $20 and $25 million. And I know you're going to talk about in a later panel, probably to put in a desal plant would be more than that, and that's to serve a relatively small community. So these numbers really do add up. I don't have the statewide numbers like the 2036 has for that.
Sure, of course. Now, of course, underneath all of these questions about how we fund our water infrastructure is, of course, how we fund our water infrastructure, which is through rates, right? And so that means that from a ratepayer-based perspective, affordability comes into this question as well.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, rural water systems are really funded by rates, and so that is a really important issue, affordability. And all of our new water sources are going to be a lot more expensive. So yeah, if there is state money, if there is grants and low interest loans and that kind of thing, it can really help these small communities because they don't benefit from the economies of scale that the bigger cities do. And so water is more expensive with smaller utilities because the infrastructure is still very expensive.
Sure, absolutely. And I know a large portion of our water infrastructure, like in the rest of the nation, was subsidized through a wave of federal investments, right, and grants that were made available. So as this infrastructure nears the end of its useful lifespan, we're seeing that affordability inflection point really kind of show its head in this moment. So it'll be interesting to watch.
Right, yeah, those programs were through the USDA Rural Development and previous agencies, and it was a lot of low interest, long-term loans and grant combinations. Some of that money is still available, but it's also dwindling. So we're advocating for the continuation of those good programs as well.
Well, we're not going to talk about federal funding, not today. Sarah, let's come over to you. Beyond aging water infrastructure and new water supply, there's also flood infrastructure funding needs, right? Can you talk to us a little bit about what the numbers are there and what conversations have started to take place this legislative session to make sure that that's also being accounted for?
Yeah, and I'll actually expand that question to wastewater too, because when we talk about water infrastructure, we have to talk about water supply, we have to talk about wastewater, and we have to talk about flood, because all of those are critical. All of our droughts are ended with a flood. We all know this, we've all experienced this. But on the flood side, the Water Development Board put out the very first state flood plan last fall. And I actually am a little bit disappointed, as Jennifer Walker pointed out last week when we were speaking on a panel, that we're not seeing more of a conversation about the recommendations that were in the state flood plan. But on the revenue side, it's really a challenge because as opposed to water and wastewater where you have those rates and you have a source of revenue to help, back some of those loans, you don't have that for flood. You don't have any sort of a revenue source. And that's just at the local level. And then when we start talking about, well, how do we fund the Flood Infrastructure Fund? Well, we need a dedicated or some sort of continuous funding source there. We don't have that for anything in water. It's back to the same conversation that we're having, right? So we've got to move forward there. And there are some conversations this session. Senator Perry has a bill to move the Flood Infrastructure Fund under the Texas Water Fund because I have a visual aid here, so that we can be able to move that funding where it needs. But because there's so much funding required in the Flood Infrastructure Fund, the concern there is just that unless there's money into the water fund, it's not going to do anybody any good because that money is going to be diluted across all of those programs. And on the wastewater side, we have a gap in our financial assistance programs' ability to even fund those. We have some of that in the Clean Water SRF that's really great, but 10 times oversubscribed, a little bit in the Rural Water Assistance Fund, but we just don't have the capacity to be able to help our systems access cost-effective financing.
I think you just made a water joke. You said diluted. That's true. Heather, I actually wanted to stick with you because I feel like, we're hearing all these big numbers, billions, tens of billions, hundreds of billions. It's easy to feel overwhelmed. And Jeremy said something earlier, which is that the good news is we don't need it all tomorrow, right? So go back to your sign of $5 billion and a $1 billion injection. Can you help us understand why $1 billion dedicated each year? How does that help us chip away at the 150 or 200 billion? help us understand that timescale.
I'd be happy to, as long as you let me talk about the $5 billion too.
It is a free country. You can say whatever you'd like.
We'll start with the $1 billion, which is what I said. It's the highest bar. It's the dream. It's an ongoing, dedicated source of revenue from whatever means that the legislature chooses that would go into the Texas Water Fund on a predictable, reliable basis each year. If not spent, that fund would build. It would draw interest. The Water Development Board nobody in the state of Texas manages money better than the Water Development Board. They capitalize and they have earnings on all of their accounts. They can grow it, they can spend it, they can rebuild it. But more than anything, that $1 billion, and we'd be happy with $2.5 billion or more too on an annual basis. But let's just start with one. Would provide both to the Water Development Board for their water infrastructure planning to finance, but also to project sponsors, that predictability and reliability that a continuous ongoing source of revenue will be there. Historically, we have to fight for funding and water about every 10 years, which you might have noticed when I went through those years. This is where we shift from historic to truly generational, where we're making an investment that's predictable and reliable and hopefully sustainable for Texans not only today, but future generations of Texans. And of course, I'm going to come back to the $5 billion. We have needs today that I've already talked about, that Sarah just hit, that Jeremy hit, $150 billion, $154 billion. Those are known needs. You're going to hear Chairwoman Stepney, if you haven't already, talk about programs at the Water Development being as high as 10 times oversubscribed. They're going to have 5-to-1 applications for SWIFT projects right now. I mean, they have known needs, project sponsors ready to turn dirt immediately. The beauty of a historic surplus is that an infusion of those surplus dollars into the Water Development Board on just a one-time basis, it's a great use of surplus dollars because it's not an ongoing investment of taxpayer resources. One-time investment would allow them to make huge, almost generational steps to implement the projects that they currently have in-house. So again, $5 billion one-time infusion coupled with a $1 billion ongoing sustainable source of dedicated revenue, it's the dream, it's historic, and it is what is before the 89th legislature in 2020-25, which is, can you make it generational? Texas-sized generational investment. I know everybody in this room will be standing behind you trying to cross that highest bar.
Thank you. So as we start to close, Jeremy, could I ask you, just in terms of what do we know right now? We've got 2.5 in the Senate budget and House budget. What do we know right now? We haven't seen Senator Perry's bill yet. What do we know?
That's a great question. What we do know for a fact is that both the House and Senate budget writers have introduced versions of the House and Senate budgets that do appropriate $2.5 billion for water infrastructure generally. This is great news insofar as it's historic insofar as it's the highest amount this legislature has ever been willing to put on the table for water infrastructure. What we don't know, and to add a little bit of drama to this conversation, the filing deadline for all legislation is next Friday, the 14th. Thank God it's not Friday the 13th. That'd be a horrible day for a bill filing deadline. We haven't yet seen the big packages that are anticipated in the House or the Senate. We do know that Senate Chairman Perry is working on a package that would create dedicated funding. And we also know that House leadership is also working on a package that would dedicate funding to the Texas Water Fund. What we don't know yet, and hopefully we'll know, if not within a minute, day, week, to be determined, what those packages look like. But we do know that they're coming.
So if there's one thing that you'd like folks here or members to take away with them, what would it be, Jeremy?
Okay, so I'll just dive in the grenade. I'll say dedicated funding for, and everyone's going to say that, right? So can we just get that one as a freebie?
Sure.
Okay, so
Absolutely.
dedicated funding for water infrastructure.
Consistency is helpful, I think.
But I'd like to say dedicated funding with oversight and accountability. We've talked about how important water infrastructure is and why these investments are essential for economic growth and development. I don't think there's a debate here. If the legislature approves this dedication, they're going to be spending taxpayers' dollars on water infrastructure, and that needs to happen. But to be fair to the legislature and to be responsive to taxpayers, there needs to be some performance measures and accountability that describe how well we're tackling our state's water infrastructure challenges. And so, yes, we're talking about increased spending for water infrastructure, but we also need to know what we're achieving with this dedicated funding for water infrastructure. How much more water supplies are we developing, and how many aging, deteriorating systems that we're fixing? So dedicated funding, but with performance and accountability.
Great, thank you. Vanessa, what's the one thing you would have folks take away?
Well, can you indulge me for 1 second? I just want to, if we have 1 minute, I want to convey some of the funding needs that groundwater districts have, and then I'll share with you my one or maybe two things to walk away with. But I've worked on groundwater issues for many years, and I just wanted to make sure that everyone understands that groundwater districts are run by really hardworking members of their community. I see many of their faces here today, and they have the impossible task of managing a resource that's both privately owned and shared. And so to do this effectively, they need data. They need access to refined modeling to be able to answer questions about how their local communities are going to be impacted and how they are going to plan for the future. And I think that that's just increasingly important when we're looking at groundwater levels declining, because I don't think it's going to be easy for rural communities to necessarily tap in to some of the new expensive sources of water that the state is going to develop. So we have to get groundwater management right. 68% of the groundwater districts in Texas have budgets that are under $500,000, which is not enough money to be able to develop that data and research that we need. The Texas Alliance of Groundwater Districts just recently did a study where they polled their members, and their members identified over $40 million worth of high and medium priority projects that would advance science across the state. That's actually a lot of money, but for groundwater districts, it's not nearly as much money as we've been talking about today. But when it comes to science, a little goes a long way. And so for my parting thoughts, I'll go ahead and say aquifers are infrastructure. I want y'all to remember that. So we must invest in their management. I would urge legislatures to support the Water Development Board's legislative appropriations request for their data and science packages. And I would also urge members to support House Bill 1400 by Cody Harris, which creates a groundwater research and science fund and would appropriate $15 million. So that's also a drop in the bucket. But again, a little goes a long way, and it would really advance data and science and our understanding of aquifers in the state. Hopefully that was fast.
You got it. Thanks, Vanessa. Well, and it occurs to us as we talk about new water supply, and you'll hear us talk about this on the next panel, produced water, brackish desalination, that's still coming out of aquifers, right? So our aquifers as infrastructure is more than just the freshwater resources as well. Lara, what's the one thing you want folks to take away?
Yeah, water supply and wastewater projects are long-term, expensive projects. We have a lot of work to do in Texas, both replacing old infrastructure and building new infrastructure to serve this big wave of population growth that we're going to continue to have, and also hiring our future workforce. So these are long-term. A lot of these projects are 20, 30 years, and the time to start planning, the time to be working on getting new water resources and new infrastructure and new workforce is now. So we don't face a crisis before we face a crisis. So,
Got it.
yeah.
Thank you. Heather, I'm going to guess, but I'm going to let you say it.
So that I get two answers, I'm going to have you all answer, what do you think I'm going to say is the one thing I want you to take away. Joey Park, what's the one thing we want you to take away?
Generational funding.
Yeah. And the amount of how much for a one-time infusion? How much for an ongoing dedicated source of revenue minimum? Annually. Thank you. Now, the thing you didn't expect I was going to say that I want to make sure, and I've been remiss that I've missed. I just whispered in Sarah's ear. I can't believe I didn't say this. Coupled with that investment, we want to make sure that the Water Development Board has the flexibility to maintain the Texas Water Fund in the manner in which it was envisioned when it was created by the 88th legislature. That allows them to meet the many diverse needs that have been identified by every panelist up here, and to address the many diverse areas of Texas. So 5+1, 89th legislature. There are many people in this room that have been waiting for you in 2025. So we look forward to working with you to make history.
Thank you. All right, Sarah, close us out. What's the one thing you want to have folks take away with them today?
I'm going to stick to just let's talk about the dedicated revenue source. It's the dream. We need a dedicated revenue source. It has to be significant, and it has to grow with time. We used to start every single session talking about what are our needs this session, and everybody would talk about how much we need in order to keep up with demands for roads. And we don't talk about that anymore because we solved that problem. We have the solution, and we can replicate it. Just last year, transportation got $5.8 billion. We're over here arguing about 1 versus 2.5. We need a higher number, and we need to solve this problem according to the answers that we already know.
All right. So now you know. Folks, join me in thanking this esteemed panel. In 2022, Texas Water Foundation had the honor of recognizing L'Oreal Stepney as our Rainmaker of the Year. At the time, she was the Deputy Executive Administrator at TCQ, and we celebrated her 30 years of public service and leadership in Texas Water. Today, she is a Governor Abbott-appointed director and chairwoman of the Texas Water Development Board, leading a critical state agency in one of our most important moments, generational moments for Texas Water. And we could not be in more capable hands. She is, after all, a rocket scientist. So join me in welcoming to the stage Chairwoman Stepney.
Good afternoon, family. Good afternoon. All right, what an amazing panel, and thank you to the Water Caucus and thank you to the Texas Water Foundation. I'm so glad to be here this afternoon. The Texas Water Development Board, we're a small agency with big responsibilities, 482 staff members, FTEs, and I can tell you they've been really, really busy. I'm so proud of them. They're committed public servants, and they come to work every day trying to secure a water future for Texas. Just briefly, I wanted to talk about the Water Development Board, then save a few things for the end for funding and planning. Founded in 1957, we funded $35.5 billion worth of projects. That's an incredible amount, right? A lot of that has taken place, though, since 2013 when SWIFT, as the panel talked about up here just a second ago, when SWIFT was put in place. And now we have the Texas Water Fund and the Flood Infrastructure Fund and all of our funding programs. We have 3 responsibilities. We do water science, we do water planning, and we do water financing. I want to talk a little bit about water planning and water financing. We have a state water plan, and now the state flood plan. They're the envy of the nation. It's amazing what we can do in Texas. Our state flood plan, we had people coming over from the Netherlands to our conference to celebrate our state flood plan. That's what we do in Texas, right? Our state water plan, and the panel before me talked a lot about the numbers, but a few that are always present for me. In 2070, if we had really severe drought conditions, if we don't implement the state water plan, we could have a potential water shortage of 6.9 million acre feet, $153 billion of economic damage. It's really important. It's really important that we implement the state water plan. Municipal demand is anticipated to take over irrigation in 2060. Dr. Potter talked about how the suburban ring around our communities, the rural community as well as the urban communities, is just exploding beyond our wildest dreams. Now we're up to, what, 1,600 people coming to Texas a day? It's incredible. And we're gonna need all of the tools in the toolbox. We're gonna need conservation. We're gonna need surface water supplies, groundwater supplies. We're gonna need seawater desal, brackish water desal, drought management, and other strategies to meet this very important need. We've talked about the price tag, $80 billion, 2018 numbers, 47 of that is the state share, $47 billion. It's quite a bit. And I want to give you guys an idea of how our responsibilities at the board have expanded. Since 2013, we had $6.9 billion in our portfolio that we managed. Loans, repayment of loans, and those sorts of things. And now we're up to $22 billion. Huge, in a decade, huge expansion, huge growth. And that just represents the need for water infrastructure in Texas. We've gone from up to $3.8 billion for new commitments. Construction projects have gone from 142 to 794 in 2024. And then we've committed $1.5 billion. It's a huge, huge increase of responsibilities, but again, it just underscores the nature of water infrastructure in Texas. Now, with respect to funding, you guys heard about SWIFT, legendary fund, landmark fund, $2 billion invested. We have almost $2 billion sitting over in the safekeeping trust, 1.8, something like that. It just shows the power of compounding, right? It's incredible, and we've been able to fund $11.5 billion worth of projects. With respect to the Flood Infrastructure Fund, we received over 2 sessions, $1.4 billion from the legislature, and we've committed $700 million of that. Incredible. Again, the foresight of the legislature. And then the Texas Water Fund, 2 years ago, voters approved $1 billion. The board, we had 3 members at the time. We decided to try to spread the wealth, spread the love as much as possible, meet the priorities that were set out in the bill, and try to cover rural Texas as well as large urban areas by using some of the money for our SWIFT program. And we're doing that. We just approved $35 million for really small entities. They range from 54, population of 54, to 918 people, small entities in Texas, as well as we'll see large projects under our SWIFT program. We were able to sell $1.6 billion in bonds this past year. So quite a bit of need, and we're excited about the flexibility that the Texas Water Fund provides us. 25% of that has to be used for new water supply, so $250 million. Again, we're excited about the flexibility. And we take our responsibilities very seriously because it's taxpayer dollars. We're fiduciaries. It's not our money. That's what our staff always say. It's not our money, it's the people's money, right? And so we take that responsibility very seriously. And I want to leave you with this. I think examples are really important to kind of drive home the need for water funding. So I've been chair for a month, been on the board for 2 years. It's been a fun month. Who knew I would go viral? I mean, when your kid is like, Mama, are you on TikTok? Anyway. Oh, that's been banned, sorry. Y'all know what I mean. My first week as chair, a gentleman was here in Austin. He found my phone number, an ordinary citizen. He called me and asked if he could meet with me. He was on his way back to Dallas. A week later, he drove back to Austin to meet with me. He was by himself. He didn't have an engineering firm. He didn't have a law firm. He didn't have a finance firm. He came by himself. He was trying to get first-time water and wastewater service for his community, and he's been trying for decades. And he asked me, and I had another staff person, another committed TWDB staff person, sit in the meeting with me and my chief of staff. And he asked, what were the deadlines for funding? We went through all of that, right? We explained it to him. And then he said, gosh, I wish I had brought the person who's in charge of our newly formed water supply corporation with me. And my staff person said, don't worry, when's your next meeting? I'll come to you. And so he went to that meeting a few weeks later so that they could get the information they needed in as real time as possible. In that same week, I had a large major river authority come and visit with me. They were explaining that they're going to have to put in a 90-mile pipeline to get the source of water to the people who need it along the I-35 corridor. 90 miles uphill. Last year when I went to the Rio Grande Valley, amazing people. They were concerned about, over the years, the Rio Grande. And so they put in a desal plant, piping water 6 miles away so that they can try to firm up their water supply. I went to a large metropolitan area, big city. They showed me their gigantic wastewater treatment plant. And this was really an example of aging infrastructure. And I'm sure it would cost millions of dollars to repair. And then with respect to flood, we did a traveling board meeting. We travel, the board does, and we like to be on the ground to see the communities. We went up to the Lubbock Panhandle area, and they explained to me about playa lakes, right? Which are so important to the community up there. But when it floods, the water stays around, right? It doesn't drain like you see in a city, right? Weeks, 2 weeks, they're still waiting for the water to drain. So it really resonated with me because flood looks differently around Texas. In urban area, the streets might become a raging river, very, very quickly. Coastal, we have hurricanes, and it just looks different around the state. $54.5 billion, the state flood plan has estimated the costs. And again, those projects are to protect life and property. Our water plan, $80 billion, as I said before. So, lastly, I had a new technology company come visit me to talk about how to treat produced water and how to meet the environmental requirements and how to do it effectively and efficiently and in a cost-effective manner. And that's just some of the 200 plus engagements that I've done since I've been on the board. But I share it with you to drive home the point that we need water infrastructure, new infrastructure, like I talked about my bucket, help with repairing existing infrastructure. We need infrastructure improvements in Texas, along with workforce. Shout out to Lara, she talked about that. So I'll leave you with this. The governor had a training for his appointees, and he said, Texas moves at the speed of business. We need to have that mindset when it comes to water. We need to have that mindset when it comes to water. We need to move at the speed of business, of our communities, of agriculture, of population growth, for water. Wouldn't y'all agree? And so with that, thank you so much for the invitation. I appreciate it. And you guys have a good afternoon.
I'd like to invite our next panel to come up and take the stage. As we start to talk about new water supply this legislative session, and how strategies like desalination, produced water, reuse are similar or different, and where there are opportunities for them to be integrated in new ways. And so we're very grateful to have this esteemed panel with us today. We've got directly to my left, Julie Nahrgang with Water Environment Association of Texas. We have Dr. Margaret Cook with us from the Houston Advanced Research Center. We have Billy Howe with Texas Farm Bureau here representing the ag voices in the room. We have Jennifer Walker with National Wildlife Federation. And finally, we've got Dr. Shane Walker with Texas Tech University and running the Produced Water Consortium. Thank you all so much for being here. Let's give them a round of applause. So, y'all, we're going to be spending a lot of time talking about supply. And there's going to be a lot of focus in particular on things like produced water, on desalination. There often is in the media. And so I thought to help ground us in this conversation, I wanted to ask each of you, when you hear new water supply, what does it mean to you? Julie?
Great. Thank you, Sarah. So when I hear new water supply, I don't think of anything that's necessarily novel. I think of something that hasn't been scaled in a way that municipalities and all Texans can take advantage of. And we can go back and forth for longer than this panel has about how and why and when we should scale it. But this is not necessarily new technology, it's just not scaled technology.
Margaret, what is new water supply to you?
When I think of new water, and if we're talking about desalination, whether that's brackish water, seawater, produced water, I think of its energy intensity. I think of the water energy nexus. So we use energy to pump, heat, treat, move our water. We use water to extract oil and gas and produce electricity. They're intricately connected. And so I think of the energy intensity of these new water sources and how when we solve this water crisis, hopefully, we don't want to also perpetuate an energy crisis. So we need both of these industries to be working together to make sure that we are water lean as possible on the energy side and the emerging technology side, while we're also adding these new energy sources.
Love it. Billy, what's new water supply to y'all?
New water in my circles generally means looking at water that we aren't currently using. You know, it's not building another reservoir and drilling another well. You know, the things that we've done in the past are not necessarily going to meet our needs in the future, and we've got to move beyond what we've done before.
Thank you. Go ahead, Jen.
Same question.
Same question.
So there's lots of strategies that fall under the new water supply banner. So to me, the most important source of new water is developing supplies that we already have present in our community before looking further afield. This means leaning into water reuse in all of its forms, or scaling up, I like how Julie described that. And then making sure that we're delivering every drop of water possible to end users. Deteriorating and leaky infrastructure is a big issue in the state. And any water that once was being lost through infrastructure, but through investment and repairs, is no longer being lost, can count as new water supply in my book. So I think we just really, we're proponents of investing in durable and resilient and nearby water supplies first and foremost.
Thank you. Dr. Walker, what's new water supply to you?
Well, in contrast to conventional sources like, groundwater, shallow fresh groundwater, and surface water, which, in many cases is now over-allocated, we need to think about significant volumes of water that are what most people would consider alternative sources. So something that we haven't been traditionally using. So I'm really excited about the opportunities that we have for desalination, as have already been mentioned, brackish groundwater, seawater, produced water, and also reusing water locally, treating it to a high standard through potable reuse.
Thank you. Well, let's leave the microphone with you here. Let's talk produced water. Legislation was passed in 2021 by Senator Charles Perry and created the Produced Water Consortium at Texas Tech to explore the beneficial uses of produced water as a potential water supply. You now run that consortium out of your outfit and have been charged with assessing the technical and regulatory parameters for safe use of produced water. Tell us about what you've found so far. Perhaps first, would you define what produced water is for this wonderful audience, and then tell us what you found on the technology, the economics, and the permitting pathway?
Yes, indeed. So historically, with conventional oil development, we were looking for what I think of as pools of oil, where you could drill a well and just draw up that oil. With the development of unconventional hydraulic fracturing, we can extract water that's really tightly bound in the geologic formations, and now that comes up with a significant amount of water. In the Delaware sub-basin of the Permian Basin, that water-to-oil ratio is roughly 4 or 5 to 1, so 4 to 5 times as much water as oil. So the joke is that the oil companies are actually water companies with a lucrative byproduct. So there's a significant amount of water. And I was really excited to learn, moving back to my alma mater at Texas Tech about 1.5 years ago, the chance to step into this produced water consortium work. It's a significant amount of water. So we're looking at roughly 20 to 25 million barrels of water per day. And so from a technology perspective, I've heard people really ask, honestly, this water is so salty. It's like 5 to 7 times the salinity of seawater. And some people ask a question, honestly, can we even treat water like this? It's so salty. And in reality, it's quite solvable. We have thermal distillation-based technologies that can treat high salinity water very well. They're also advancing membrane-based technologies that would be lower capital costs and lower energy costs than thermal treatment systems. So excitingly, in 2024, last calendar year, we had a handful of significant pilot study demonstrations in the Permian Basin demonstrating that we can technically solve this water challenge. So we can treat the water to high quality standards, 99.9% salt removal with some additional treatment polishing steps to make the water truly clean and safe. So technically, yes, that's doable. Then there's a question of economics. Can we do it economically? Well, we were just at a Produced Water Society meeting in Houston a couple of weeks ago, and for the first time that I've seen publicly, some companies announcing treatment costs of desalinating produced water in the range of $1.30 per barrel. So for comparison, disposal costs are in the range of 75 cents per barrel. With some concerns about seismicity and limited pore space in the injection well. You may have seen in the news, even just in the last couple of weeks, some earthquakes, 5.0 in the Delaware Basin. It's an urgent need to decrease the amount of water that we're injecting in the Permian Basin. So there's a shifting economic space where that $1.50 to $2 per barrel is feasible for having an alternate source of offloading that produced water. So then the question is, what about permitting pathway? And again, just in the last year and a half, some exciting developments. The Railroad Commission has a pilot study framework for small-scale demonstrations of land applications, such as crop irrigation or rangeland restoration. And with the significant volumes of water that we're talking about, we could conceivably restore hundreds of thousands, maybe even millions of acres of land in the Permian Basin area. Especially by reestablishing some of the bunch grasses, especially, we could actually kickstart and revitalize a hydrologic cycle in the Permian Basin by recharging groundwater. The TCEQ has also been authorized to issue surface discharge permits for treated, desalinated, produced water, and they're actively engaged in ramping up that program with several applications for permits already in the queue for that system. So exciting to see 2 permitting mechanisms where these treatment technologies could be implemented in affordable ways that could bring significant volume of water, especially to West Texas.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thanks for sharing that. So, Billy, speaking of economies of scale, we often talk about the water supply needs of our urban and rural communities, our drinking water needs, but there are other industries, of course, that are facing similar challenges looking at the water supply forecast. Our agricultural and livestock industries, which make up a significant portion of the Texas economy as well. Tell us a little bit about how that water supply forecast is affecting that industry in different parts of the state, and what strategies like produced water or desalination might mean for them.
Thank you. Well, I think if you want the example of what can happen if you don't have enough water, look at ag right now. You've got cotton gins that are closing in the Panhandle because they can't make enough of a cotton crop. You've got the sugar mill that closed in the Rio Grande Valley because there wasn't enough water to grow sugar cane. You've got rice infrastructure on the lower Colorado that's not there anymore because they went through years of the water not getting released to them anymore from the island lakes. You've got all these issues that are real and present in agriculture right now because of a shortage of water supply. And it's just something our folks are having to deal with. Not to mention some of the rice farmers down in the lower Colorado, LCRA is selling them the water at cost, and they can't afford it as an input to grow the crop.
Help us understand that. What do you mean? So what they're able to sell the crop for, what the cost of the water is going to impact what?
Well, we've got, right now, we have record input cost in agriculture. Everything is costing, just like all y'all have dealt with inflation. The cost of fertilizer, fuel, everything is so much more, yet commodity prices are still what they were in the 1970s. So you put those two things together, and then you add, you're an irrigated farmer on top of that, so you're having to pay for water from the river authority. I mean, that's why 80% of ag irrigation in the state of Texas is actually groundwater. They own it. They're the landowner. But that other 10%, I mean, they're suffering, like in the valley. It's just an input cost and relying on a foreign country to give you water. It's not a great water supply strategy. So, I mean, that's one of the reasons why we're wanting to support this effort so much, is because we've got to find a solution to some of these problems in agriculture. I do have some of my members that have called me and said that some of the companies that are working on cleaning up the produced water are having conversations with them about their economics, trying to figure out what is the cost point at which the irrigated farmers would be able to afford to use the produced water to continue to irrigate out in West Texas.
Sure. Yeah, I appreciate that you started a conversation with me by saying that ag is a function of economics, and so is water, these strategies as well. So continuing on the economics line, Margaret, I'm going to come over to you and say, you described earlier what the water energy nexus is, or the cyclical relationship between the two. Talk to us about, in the context of this policy discussion on new water supply and the energy that it might require then to treat and move the water, what are the challenges we need to be looking out for on the water energy nexus front when we think about water supply?
Well, I want to go even earlier in the conversation to Jennifer's comments. Additional water supplies that we can get from just conserving more, repairing those leaks, reusing water, that's going to be less energy intensive and something that we can get a little bit faster at the same time that we pursue these new water sources, because the new water that we're talking about, the new facilities, takes a lot of time. So I know you asked an economic question, and I'm answering it slightly different.
A time answer.
Yes. Additional variables at play. So while we're solving the new water issues, we can also address our current water issues and save some energy at the same time because of those lower energy solutions. And I'm of the opinion that all of these things should be on the table. We need a lot of water. We should be doing all the things that we can. Excuse me, sorry. At the same time, these technologies are very energy intensive, and we have an energy crisis in this state still. The legislature did take a step to address that with the Texas Energy Fund last session, and that added funding for power plants. So again, we're talking about funding that went to other types of infrastructure. Energy and transportation have gotten large infusions. Let's give water a large infusion. But stepping off that pedestal, just trying to trumpet the horn. That investment was for the type of power plants that are water intensive. Not every type of power plant that we have is water intensive, but those can be water intensive. If we have steam electric or combined cycle power plants, they're going to use water for cooling likely, unless they use an air cooling source. So I say that because we can encourage these energy at these power plants, these energy sources, and other emerging technologies that are going to add to our water intensity across the state. We can encourage them to be more water lean. We can encourage or require them to use best available technologies. We can encourage or require them to use reuse. There's a power plant in the Austin area that uses reuse water for cooling. When a user does not require fresh water, we should be encouraging them to not use fresh water where possible. And that can be done across the energy industry and across some of these emerging technologies like data centers, hydrogen, carbon capture and sequestration. We can also partner with these types of users, with these emerging technologies, on new water investment. And that gets us back to the economics, which is what you were asking about.
Yeah, thank you. So Sarah mentioned it earlier on the last panel, but in addition, another big conversation that gets lost when we talk about solving for water supply is, of course, clean water and the utilities that supply it. Julie, help us understand why wastewater, a critical part of our water infrastructure, is also clean water supply. And what are the challenges there?
Yeah, thank you, Sarah. Appreciate you teeing me up for one of my favorite conversations. But so when we talk about water infrastructure, it's a holistic view of water infrastructure, and the wastewater infrastructure side of things is often implied. But I want to get away from that implied piece, and I want to make it explicit. And so to that end, when we talk about wastewater infrastructure, what we're actually talking about are factories that take wastewater and take a waste and turn it into a valuable resource in reclaimed water, or biosolids, or nutrient-rich fertilizers, or struvite, right? So we are actually talking about clean water factories or resource recovery factories. And so if we are to talk about, and I'm going to jump right back on top of that funding pedestal that you stepped up, I'm going to jump up there with you. So if we're talking about funding, we need to be explicit about the funding and the allocation of that funding and ensure that it goes to wastewater infrastructure as well. You know, we have a flood plan that my esteemed panelists before talked about. We have a state water plan that was hard fought in actually getting the funding for it and getting the plan passed. And like, again, my colleague said, we are the envy of the nation in how we plan for these things. We do not plan for our wastewater infrastructure. We let it fail us, and then we look for funding. If you think about Houston, Houston has an $11 billion consent decree. And that's just what they estimate now.
What's a consent decree?
Why, thank you, Sarah. So there are a number of different consent decrees, but when I say it, I mean a clean water consent decree. So that means that you have violated the Clean Water Act, which is another reason why we call it clean water, because the Clean Water Act is the federal legislation that underpins what we do. And if you are under a clean water consent decree, the federal government has stepped in and said, you, municipality, city, you are mismanaging this infrastructure. We are going to dictate to you now how to manage it, the timeline for what you're doing, and how we need you to do it. And that's negotiated, but you're negotiating with both your arms tied behind your back, essentially. And so Houston is under a clean water consent decree. San Antonio is rolling off of theirs, but they're still technically under it. Corpus Christi is under a clean water consent decree. Tyler is under a clean water consent decree. Baytown is coming under a clean water consent decree. And if any of y'all are counting, that's 5. And that is 3 to 4 more than any other state in the nation, y'all. So we got some big wastewater problems. And when we talk about how wastewater can be a viable source of water reuse, we need to talk about how we're going to fix the infrastructure here and now, how we're going to acquire that funding to fix that infrastructure here and now. And then we talk about, hey, look at this resource we're recovering, this clean water we're producing. How do we put that back, not necessarily into only rivers, streams, oceans, marshlands, but how can we put it back in a centralized system of purple pipes that can then go to industry, that can then go to point use areas in irrigation, right? And then we can get into, can we decentralize it too? Can we have on-site reuse? Or can we also have, cleaned wastewater that is turned into clean water that someone can then drive up to, let's say, wastewater plant Oso in Corpus Christi and fill your bucket? Well, that is happening right now. That is happening today. And no, that's not scalable, or that's not scaled in Corpus, But that is a way that we can have fit-for-use water if we invest in our wastewater infrastructure in a meaningful way.
Jennifer, in addition to water supply infrastructure and strategies, there's a movement to think differently about how more water is available within existing systems. Julie set you up perfectly. Strategies like reuse, either direct potable or decentralized, are increasingly playing a role in how water supply in cities like Austin are thinking about their future water supply. Tell us about it. What's going on? What are the strategies there, and what are the economies of scale that are possible when we think differently about it?
So a million things I want to respond to that everybody just said. We need to go have a beer after this, y'all, together and have a chat. Okay, so I just want to riff off of something that Margaret said about, she may not say it exactly like this, but this is how I wrote it down. When a use does not require potable water, don't use potable water, which is way better than saying the ways that Julie and I talk about fit for use and all this other stuff. If it doesn't require potable water, how about we don't use potable water? And potable water is drinking water that comes out of our faucets. Hopefully y'all are drinking tap water, I hope so. It's water that comes out of our faucets, potable water, but we don't need to put potable water on our lawns. We don't need to use it to flush our toilets with. We don't need to use it for lots of things. So one of the things that are happening is we're seeing a shift where we're using non-potable water to meet new non-potable needs where possible in cities that are growing. I mean, this is something that's happening in Austin. And actually, if you look at their future water supply planning in Austin, which I dabble in doing on a volunteer basis, you'll see we have this pie chart in Austin where we show the piece of the pie of how much potable and non-potable water we have, and that we're really actively trying to grow the non-potable pie, because anything that we use, any water that we're using to meet non-potable needs, either water that's captured on site through AC condensate or rainwater, or through a decentralized wastewater treatment system or a centralized purple pipe, is water that we're not pulling from our main water source, like our reservoir or our groundwater well or whatever it is, that we're sending to the water treatment plant, and then we're using energy and chemicals to treat, and then we're pushing through pipes to our homes. Any of that we can reduce through generating water on site and reusing it, or accessing a centralized reuse line, is greatly beneficial to our communities. And it reduces pressure on the potable water supply. And I think, we have to be super intentional about how much water do we have that is already in our community or nearby to our community that we can access and either use or use better or use differently. Building pipelines and pushing water across the state is hugely expensive, and it may be necessary in some cases, but there's a lot of untapped water in our communities as well, and there's a lot of water leaking in our infrastructure as well. About 51 gallons per connection per day, based on a study that we did. That's a tremendous amount of money. I mean, water, well, money too, and energy, all of that. But one thing I want to mention too, because we haven't mentioned it, I've been talking about it, and I've been doing my visits today. I hope everybody has. Today is part of Texas Water Day. And I've been mentioning this in a lot of offices, and people kind of aren't really aware of this or not connecting the dots, but because there's a lot to think about in this water issue. But Julie talked a lot about wastewater investment and the need there, and a lot of that investment that's available comes through the state revolving funds, through the Clean Water State Revolving Fund, and through the Inflation, Infrastructure, and Jobs Act, or bipartisan infrastructure law, depending on what you like to call it. Texas received $2.9 billion from the federal government to go through our state revolving fund programs. And that's going to end soon. That's going to end in fiscal year 26. And after that, we're going to see a great reduction in the amount of money available through our SRF programs. And our base funding for SRF programs is being really chipped away at through earmarks. So I think it's just another reason that we really need to, this is another illustration of the reason of why we need to think really critically about how we allocate money into the Texas Water Fund, and we need to make sure that there's a lot of flexibility and that there's an opportunity not only to invest in water infrastructure and water supply, but also in wastewater, because it's our future water supply, but it's also our clean water. So
it's all of the above. Shane, I'm going to come back over to you. You know, I find that there's a tendency when we get asked questions, either by members of the legislature, members of the media, about one strategy versus another. I can't help it. Before Texas Tech, you were running the Inland Desalination Center at UTEP in El Paso, correct? One of the cities that's invested heavily in diversifying its water portfolio and using a number of strategies, including reuse and ASR and brackish desalination. But there's a tendency when people ask about these strategies to think that either there's a silver bullet solution that's going to fix everything, right? Some perfect new strategy, innovation, technology, or two, that there's a bad strategy or a good strategy. And it seems to me like we're all kind of solving for the same thing, right? A filter is a filter is a filter, and it's just about pushing a bunch of water with enough energy through it and then moving it to where it needs to be. Talk to me a little bit about how, you know, looking at produced water, looking at desalination from where you're sitting at the center in Texas Tech, where do you think the parallels are across these strategies? Help us. Well, I was going to say decriminalize, but that's not the word I'm looking for. Deconstruct all these strategies and how they work together.
I completely agree that there's not a single one-size-fits-all solution or the next best option for every utility is X. It really is site-specific. So you have to look at an inventory of where are we at now. I mean, I would really encourage people to look at El Paso Water as a model. In my opinion, they're one of the most progressive water utilities in the country. They've been thinking about a diversified water supply portfolio for decades, like 50 or 60 years. So they've invested in this diversified portfolio just one step at a time, you know, consistent, methodical investment. Ed Archuleta came in the late 80s, and he took a couple years to really survey the situation. There were a lot of people running around saying the sky's falling, we're going to run out of water. There was concerns with Fort Bliss being there, are we going to have enough water for this military base? And they started with conservation, which I totally believe in and agree with. Let's first be wise stewards of the water that we do have and use that most efficiently. Next, how can we start investing in some alternative water supplies so that when a drought does come, it's not if, but when a drought does come, what are we going to have? So they implemented potable reuse, indirect potable reuse with the Fred Hervey plant in the 80s, right? They're looking at 40 years of operation of an indirect potable reuse system with aquifer recharge. So that's phenomenal foresight on their part. They invested in the K. Bailey Hutchison desalination plant in the early 2000s. It came online in 2007. And that facility is one of the largest of its kind. People come from all over the world to visit that facility because it's still a historic landmark facility. And now they're soon to break ground on a direct potable reuse project. As far as I know, it would be the first direct-to-distribution system of its kind. So again, just one step after another. How do we take the next step? What's the next lowest hurdle? And sometimes it's a significantly more complex system, but if you really approach it on a long planning horizon, like some of these projects are 10 to 20 years to bring to fruition, but you keep taking the next step year after year, and then you look at where they are now, their population per capita consumption is nearly half of what it was in the late 70s, and they've got a really beautiful diversified portfolio with built-in redundancy. When that freeze hit, you know, in what was it, 2011 or something, with that severe freeze, you know, they were able to bring that desal plant to full speed in the middle of a winter, you know, which most of the time you think of drought resilience, but in that case it was a freeze. So I'm just really impressed with their approach.
Technical question about El Paso, it doesn't rain very much over there, does it?
Yeah, I think it's around 8 inches per year. I think the last year I was there, it was 4.5 inches on the year. So yeah, some years are pretty dry.
So one more thing over here. salinity. It feels like a lot of us are solving for salinity. And just for those that are not familiar, you talked about produced water and it being the level of salinity relative to marine. Can you just help us understand from potable water, produced water, marine, kind of what's the spectrum of salinity
so
that we're solving
the EPA
for?
secondary limit for drinking water is 500 milligrams per liter. And in Texas and New Mexico, the secondary limit is 1,000 milligrams per liter. So that's the limit of what we consider fresh water. Above that, we call it brackish. So for instance, the feed water to the K. Bailey Hutchison desal plant is about 2,500 milligrams per liter.
So that's groundwater.
That's brackish
just a little
groundwater,
bit,
right.
Okay.
And, brackish water, depending on where you are in the state, by the way, over 90% of the state has brackish groundwater underneath it. The Texas Water Development Board BRACS program has estimated 3.2 billion acre feet available. I did the quick math, back of the envelope. If you looked at 75% recovery, it would be 130 years worth of water at our current use for the whole state. So a significant amount of brackish water available. That can range anywhere from a couple thousand milligrams per liter to as high as 10,000 milligrams per liter. Above that, most people start calling it saline instead of brackish. And then seawater salinity is around 32,000 to 35,000 milligrams per liter. Produced water can range from 100 to 200,000 milligrams per liter. So very salty. But again, the technologies can treat at any level in there. Nanofiltration can be a more energy efficient option for lower salinity brackish groundwater. There have been a number of cities in Texas that have already implemented that. Electrodialysis reversal is another technology that can be used for lower salinity water. Brackish water RO is available for those medium salinity brackish waters. RO is also typically the most energy efficient method for seawater desalination in that 35,000 milligrams per liter range. And then, as I said, the thermal distillation-based technologies for the extremely high salinity treatment.
Thank you. Panel, I think I'm seeing that we've got a chairman of House Natural Resources over here someplace. So I'm gonna draw us to a quicker close than I had anticipated, but by asking each of you if you would share, as we move through session and this generational opportunity, a conversation to talk about water infrastructure, to talk about supply, and to talk about funding, which water supply strategies do you think are going to be transformative for Texas and that give you hope?
Well, I'm biased to think that brackish water can really help a lot of people in the, especially in the, western part of the state where it's drier. Produced water, certainly in the Permian Basin area, there's an abundance there. It could help the Pecos River down to Amistad and down the Rio Grande.
Thank you. What gives you hope, Jennifer?
I think that for us at National Wildlife Federation, while we focus on cities, we clearly want our communities to have access to clean and affordable and reliable water supplies. I mean, we're all part of communities, but we also really want to focus in on managing supplies, as I'm so glad to hear everyone else on the panel does too, in a way that really focuses in on efficiency and repairing our infrastructure so that every drop that's possible to get to its endpoint can. Because if we don't do that well, we're not going to have water left over to meet environmental needs in our state. And that is such an important part of being in Texas and being a Texan, surviving the summers, and just, we can't have all the wonderful things about the state if we don't take really, really good care of our water supplies and make that investment to do it.
Thank you. Billy, what do you think is going to be is a transformational water supply, and what gives you hope?
Do away with homeowners associations. No, I'm just kidding. Kidding. I lived in Circle C for 15 years. I told my wife when we moved to Waco for me to go to the other office, one, we're going to live out of town, and secondly, there's not going to be a homeowner association. So I'll tell you, during last summer, my water bill was $65 a month because there was no outdoor watering going on. And let me tell you, that common Bermuda grass, as soon as it rains, it greens back up again. It is wonderful stuff, right? So, no, to be serious, I mean, I think the potential for direct reuse, let's reuse what we've already used and use it as efficiently as we can. And then also, we know that in this state, we have tremendous flooding. And to whatever extent we can figure out how to capture those flood waters in an environmentally responsible way, and put that in the aquifer or store it someplace where we can use it in the future, I think that would be a game changer for the state, personally.
Thank you.
I don't know how I follow getting rid of HOAs. That almost got a standing ovation. I would say, and it's not necessarily a water supply, but it is a strategy, better coordination. And that covers a lot of different things. That covers better planning between the energy and water sectors. That covers taking one man's waste or woman to make that your own water source. So using that non-fresh water when possible, whether that's brackish water or wastewater or something of that sort. And it covers what I mentioned earlier about partnering with some of those emerging technologies like data centers to fund some of these water strategies, because this infiltration of funds, it's huge, it's important, we need it, but it's not enough. And so we're going to need to partner with a lot more folks that can help us pay for it. And if they can do that, that would be great.
Thank you. All right, Julie, final word. What's the transformative water strategy and what gives you hope?
Yeah, well, those are two separate things, strangely enough. Transformative, what my fellow panelists have said, I think membrane technology, desal, anything that also allows us to use or to have indirect and direct potable reuse, right? To use that water that we have right now that is coming into our wastewater infrastructure and pushed out as clean water, let's reuse that. That is a here and now need that we can fund and that we can make happen. And then what gives me the ultimate hope is just the confluence of the leadership in water thinking today. Y'all, this is pretty incredible. And we're talking about a generational investment. I think this is generational leadership as well. You know, we have Chair Stepney, Chair Pop, Chairman Perry, and Chair of our current Water Caucus, Dan Kitzman, was here, and Chair Cody Harris as well. You know, and I went down that path of naming people, and now I'm not going to be able to name all of them. So let's just leave it with everyone in the audience, with generational leadership. And that includes my fellow panelists on this panel, and then my brilliant friends on the previous panel as well. I think that that is what gives me the most hope.
Well, on that beautiful note, let's thank this wonderful panel. Thank y'all. Fortunate to have a dedicated group of water champions at the Texas legislature over the years. And in the Texas House, those champions have long been members of the House Natural Resources Committee. Despite the departure of a number of House water leaders after the last session, sometimes lovingly referred to as the Great Water Loss, am I right, Sarah Kirkle? We are fortunate to have a strong bench of dedicated water champions, including the new chairman of the House Natural Resources Committee, Representative Cody Harris. Join me in welcoming him to the stage.
Sarah, thank you so much. Thank you all for being here to talk about water and to visit the offices of different members. Real quick, I've seen several different state reps throughout the crowd. If y'all are actually members of the legislature, will you, or staff, raise your hand. Wow, that's awesome. Man, that's so great. You know, I learned a lot from listening to a part of that panel. And when you consider the fact that Texas has over 1,300 people a day moving here, we're over 30 million people, 8th largest economy in the world, I think it's beginning to permeate the average person that we have to figure out our water needs for the future if we're going to continue to make sure that the Texas miracle is able to keep going. And so that's kind of the common thread, is that we all agree we've got to be able to address these concerns. The differences come when we start talking about how we do that. And so that's why it's so important for y'all to take the time to come into your members' offices for especially your state rep, whoever represents you. to develop a relationship and help them understand what's important to your district. Because when it comes time, I'm sure you've all heard the old adage, you've probably heard it multiple times today, but in the legislature, whiskey's for drinking and water's for fighting. And it's important when that fight comes for your member to be educated on how the policy that's contemplated before the legislature will affect your area. And then if we can get past that, how can we work together to make sure that we provide for the water needs of future generations of Texans? And so I think that's where we have a unique opportunity this session. When you consider the fact that we've got over a $20 billion surplus, and we have a legislature who has been engaged in learning and understanding water policy over the last 2 years. One thing that I was really encouraged by over the interim, as we had these new freshman member coming in, we had workshops, little unofficial workshops to talk about water, to talk about the issues that we want to address next session. And just about every freshman that was coming into the legislature participated in those workshops. And I see a lot of the freshmen in here today. So thank you guys for wanting to dig into this topic because it's complex. It's one of the most complex issues that we face. And the problem is, no matter what we do, none of it is going to make it onto your primary mail ballots, mail pieces, because it's not sexy enough. But the truth is, if we don't dig in and do the hard work of figuring out how to solve this problem for future generations of Texans, then we have done a huge disservice to the people who elected us. The important things, the most important and costly things from a dollar standpoint that we're going to contemplate as a legislature in the budget are water, roads, education, and transportation, and health care. And so that's why I'm excited. We're singing Kumbaya a little bit with the Senate, which we don't do on very many things. But we do agree between the chambers that we need to fund water infrastructure and future water supply. Now, we're going to fight over how much for which of those, but we agree on the overall principle that we need to put some of the surplus into it. That's why we've got $2.5 billion designated in the base bill of the House budget and the Senate budget to go to the water fund. And then Senator Perry has filed his dedicated funding stream, and then the House is going to do that in the coming days as well, to make sure that there is a constitutionally dedicated funding stream to fund both existing infrastructure and future water supplies for the future of Texas, and I couldn't be more excited about that. And it's a great thing for the state. So I was instructed that I only had to talk 5 to 10 minutes, so I think I'm getting close to the 5-minute mark. But sincerely, I want to thank you for taking the time away from your homes, away from your businesses to come here and get engaged in the policy-making process. Because make no mistake, your presence here and you visiting with your state reps affects what we will be voting on in the next few weeks. So Wednesday, in a couple of days, I will have my first hearing in the Natural Resources Committee. It'll be organizational, and then we will get to work immediately after that hearing bills. And so I couldn't be more excited to represent my hometown in East Texas, but more importantly, be helping lead on the most important issue that we face as a state. And Sarah, y'all please give Sarah a round of applause for the work that she's done. The momentum that we've built in the new members and in the legislature is because of the work that Sarah has done with the Texas Water Foundation and the Water Caucus, building the Water Caucus. Rarely do you have a bipartisan, bicameral effort to tackle the same issue, and Sarah's done a phenomenal job with that. So thank you all so much for coming. Appreciate your time.
Well, as per usual, he's way too kind because it's really a lot of people in this ecosystem that have been working towards that. Thank you, Chairman. Last legislative session, Chairman Tracy King formed the first Texas House Water Caucus, an educational effort to support the next generation of water leadership in the Texas Capitol. And while we lost more than a few water champions since then, the Texas Water Caucus has continued to grow and has indeed become bicameral. It's now over 80 members strong and growing, with dedicated leadership from House Chairman Representative Stan Kitzman, whom you met earlier. So in honor of Texas Water Day, do we have very many members of the Texas Water Caucus here? Raise your hand if you're here. All right. We would love to invite you to come up and take a photo. And I'm going to... All right, folks. Still running it directly on time. I'd like to close by thanking once again the sponsors that made today possible, and all of you for taking the time today to join us, and to all the members of the Water Caucus who have been showing up week after week to learn about these important issues and will continue to meet. I'd like to now invite you to join us at Schultz Garden for an evening reception filled with good conversation, continued conversation, Margaret, with food and drink and live music. We'll be there from 5 to 8.